You've now heard Ravi explain the 3-4-5 grid that he uses to understand and assess a worldview. The rest of this course will focus on the four categories of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Beginning next week, you'll have a full week on each of those categories. But first, we'll take a more detailed look at the categories themselves and how they can be applied to particular ways of seeing the world. In this lecture, Andy Bannister will help us to think through three major worldviews: atheism, Islam, and Christianity. And he'll do so by comparing what they have to say about origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Hope you enjoy.
Andy Bannister is our Canadian director and has led the team there in a fantastic way. His doctoral work was done in Islamics, more particularly in the origin of the Quran, from the University of London. Andy has also covered much of this globe, and as you listen to him, you'll see he's a tremendous debater. He used to go into the public arena and take on, at the speaker's corner, take on adversaries and so on, but he does it with a tremendous sense of gentleness, now staying busy across Canada and whenever we need him elsewhere. So with his particular specialization in Islamics and that key component of the origin of the Quran, you are dealing with a very rigorous apologetic issue. You will be well blessed by listening to Andy.
Our world is moving frighteningly fast. The Earth rushes around the Sun at 67,000 miles an hour, and sometimes it almost seems as if we can feel it move beneath our feet. Technology changes so rapidly that we can't keep up. Every answer is just a Google away. We see 3,000 adverts a day. Most of us have the web, we have email, we have Facebook, we have Twitter. We are permanently wired. And what that means is that the average person is saturated with information. Most of us are probably suffering from information overload. How do we process everything that is thrown at us? How do we make sense of the world? Well, the answer is that you use your worldview. Your worldview is the set of spectacles through which you view the world. It's not so much what you see as you look around you, but it's how you process it. It's not what you see, but what you see with. Your worldview generates the basic assumptions that you bring to the questions of life, to the decisions you make, to the opinions you form, to the conclusions you draw. And here's the thing. When it comes to presenting the gospel, when it comes to engaging in evangelism, worldviews are vitally important to understand because the gospel is never heard in isolation. When you're talking with an unchurched friend, be they an atheist or a Muslim or a Buddhist or a New Ager, they will have a set of presuppositions that they bring to the table, that they bring to that conversation. And everybody has a worldview. Everybody has a worldview. It is impossible to live without one because everybody needs a framework through which they process and assess their experiences. Everybody has a worldview too, because every human being, no matter what your belief system, has to address a number of basic questions about reality, questions that are very deep and very profound. Every human being has to face four questions: the question of origin, the question of meaning, the question of morality, and the question of destiny. What do I mean by those four questions? Well, the origin question. Where did I come from? What does it mean to be human? The meaning question. Is there purpose to life, or is everything simply random? The morality question. How should I live? How do I respond to the difficult ethical choices that confront me? And then finally, the destiny question. Where, ultimately, am I headed? Everybody has a worldview. The question is not whether you or the friend with whom you want to share Christ has a worldview. The question is simply this: is it a good one? And addressing worldviews is one of the primary tasks, perhaps the primary task of apologetics, because if you can learn to probe people's deepest ideas, unpack their assumptions, investigate their worldview, then you can present the gospel with greater clarity and remove potential objections. Now, this need for us to grapple with the big questions of life is interesting for another reason. It enables us to put competing worldviews to the test. You see, we can take the different worldviews that are out there and we can look at how they answer those four basic questions. The question of origin, the question of meaning, the question of morality, and the question of destiny. You can take a worldview and you can test it as it addresses those questions to see how it meets some important tests. We can look at a worldview and ask, is it internally consistent? Is it comprehensive? Does it correspond to reality? Does it have explanatory power? Does it resonate with your experience? And in particular, what does your worldview, what does a particular worldview you're looking at look like when it's lived out in the real world? Indeed, is it livable? Is perhaps one of the most profound questions we can ask of a worldview. To show you how this works, to take this from the kind of theoretical, as it were, to the practical, I want to look briefly at two major competing worldviews. We're going to take a look at atheism and at Islam, and we're going to compare them as we go to Christianity. You see, my friend Os Guinness has said this. He says, contrast is the mother of clarity. In other words, when we compare two things, when we compare two worldviews, we see so much more clearly. Now, in the multicultural setting in which so many of us live, both those competing worldviews I mentioned, atheism and Islam, are everywhere. We look everywhere in our culture, particularly in the West. We see a rigid secularism and atheism on the rise, a worldview that says there is no God and that in many cases religion should be banished in all of its forms from the public square. That worldview is everywhere. And then, of course, we see Islam all over the place. It's a rigid monotheism that is the world's second biggest religion. Islam is growing rapidly here in the West. Many of us are encountering Muslims at work, in our neighborhoods or on the university campuses. These are just two of the competing worldviews on offer. Now, faced with such a plethora of choice of worldviews in our culture, one of the things I increasingly find is you run across people who mistakenly think that you can just pick whichever worldview you like the look of. You can hitch your wagon to any star. Fancy Buddhism? Well, become a Buddhist. Fancy Islam? Well, become a Muslim. It doesn't matter. I hear that from so many people in our culture, particularly university students. But the thing is this, ideas have consequences. The worldview that you choose matters. It matters profoundly. Why? Well, for this reason. Ideas quickly become idealisms. Idealisms flower into ideologies, and so which worldview you choose can have profound consequences, both for you and the culture you live in. Well, our time is short, but what I plan to do over the next 20 minutes or so is to briefly look at our four worldview questions: origin, meaning, morality, destiny, and see what those two worldviews I've talked about, atheism and Islam, have to say. And as we go, we're going to ask questions like these. Are the answers they provide consistent? Do they ring true with reality? And in particular, can they be lived out? And as we go, we're going to compare them with what the Christian worldview has to say. So let's begin with the first worldview question, the question of origins. Now, that's a fascinating question, the origins question. Where do we come from? Where does our universe come from? Where does reality itself come from? Well, our worldviews differ vastly in their answers. Firstly, consider atheism. Atheism is part of a broader worldview called naturalism, which claims that only material things exist. All that matters is matter. For the atheist, there is no God. There is no supernatural. There is no spiritual realm. Everything is just matter and molecules, physics and chemistry and biology. And thus my atheist friends attempt to answer the origin question in those terms. And so naturalism, atheism would say that several billion years ago, the universe began. We don't know the cause. Maybe we're one of an infinite series of universes, the so-called multiverse. Or perhaps, as Professor Stephen Hawking, the great physicist, has claimed, maybe gravity itself caused the universe to emerge, to pop into existence from nothing. Listen to these words from Stephen Hawking. He writes this, he says, spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing. Why the universe exists, why we exist. It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper to set the universe going. Well, for the atheist, eventually our galaxy formed, then our solar system, and then 4 billion or so years ago, life emerged from the primordial chemical soup and slowly evolved into more and more complex forms until finally human beings emerged. And on this worldview, human beings are just another animal, and they're merely physical. There is no soul, there is no spirit, there is no ghost in the machine. What about Islam? Well, Islam would disagree profoundly with what I've just described. My Muslim friends would say, no, the universe was created. It was created from nothing by an all-powerful creator God sometime in the distant past. That God is, however, for my Muslim friends, distant and remote, far above us and transcendent. Indeed, for many Muslim theologians, their God is actually ultimately unknowable. How does he relate to his creation? Well, in Islam, human beings are merely his slaves. Those are two very different answers, atheism and Islam, and here's the thing, both ultimately fail to satisfy. For example, atheism and naturalism, for all of its efforts to explain the universe and humanity purely in terms of the material, I think falls foul when it comes to the human mind. Biologist Rupert Sheldrake, no evangelical Christian, he put it this way. He wrote, attempting to explain mental activity in terms of physical activity is circular, because science itself depends upon mental activity. Furthermore, atheism also fails to account for a near universal human phenomena, spirituality. The leading sociologist Peter Berger put it this way. He wrote, the religious impulse, the quest for meaning that transcends the restricted space of empirical existence in this world, has been a perennial feature of humanity. In other words, religion and spirituality have always been with us, and our worldview surely has to explain them. Atheism tends to fail. Well, what about our second worldview? Islam, well, it acknowledges that spirituality exists, yes, but it does so teasingly. In Islam, yes, God exists, but you can't actually know him. There's no way of knowing him personally. The great missionary to India of a generation or so ago, Carl Fander, wrote this. He said, if Muslims think at all deeply, they find themselves absolutely unable to know God. And thus Islam effectively leads to agnosticism. Well, what about Christianity? Like Islam, Christians believe in an all-powerful creator God, but Christianity goes further and stresses the personal nature of that God, who after creating human beings was found, according to Genesis 3 verse 8, walking and talking within his creation. The God of the Bible is a God who can be known, a God who is personal, very different from that distant God of Islam, who is so far above us, so far removed, that he cannot be known personally, and we can only relate to him as his slaves. What about our second worldview question, the question of meaning? Is there meaning to life? Is there a purpose to our existence? Well, a consistent atheism would say none. In fact, the very question is bizarre. As one leading Oxford atheist put it to me just the other day, he said, Andy, there is no such thing as a why question. Why questions are merely packets of how questions. For the atheist, there is no meaning, no purpose, no reason for our existence. You and I are just brief sparks in the infinite blackness, and then when we wink out, that is it. Ultimately, human beings will go the way of every species, and when we're gone, life on Earth will roll on without us. And then one day, the sun will expand and swallow the Earth, and our solar system will become just a cold, dead ember. One day, too, the universe itself will end, empty and dark and cold. There is no escape, there is no hope, there is no meaning. What about the Islamic worldview? Well, my Muslim friends would disagree with what I've just described of atheism there, and they would say, no, there is a God who has infused the universe with meaning and purpose. Islam would say that purpose is to obey God's commandments, to ensure that our list of good deeds outweigh our bad deeds. Again, two very different answers there in atheism and in Islam, and none, I think, ultimately satisfy. It takes an extremely brave atheist to truly admit there is no meaning, and most importantly, to try to live out that consistently. It's a very bleak prospect. Bertrand Russell, one of the most famous atheists of the 20th century, said this. He said, we must build our lives upon the firm foundation of unyielding despair. That takes some courage to live that out. Well, can we, as some atheists have tried to do, create our own meaning? Some of my atheist friends have said, it's okay, there's no meaning in the universe, but I can create my own. Well, the problem is that doesn't really work on atheism. The universe doesn't suddenly acquire meaning just because I say it does. And what if my meaning conflicts with your meaning? You decide your meaning in life is to help small, cute, fluffy animals, and I decide my meaning is to club them to death with a baseball bat. How do we reconcile that difference? And what of Islam? Well, ultimately, its answer is a bleak one too. Because yes, you can slavishly follow the dictates of the Quran and Islamic law. You can do your best to obey those commands. But the one thing you are not permitted to do in Islam is to ask the question, why? Yet asking why is fundamentally part of what it means to be human. So what about Christianity? Well, Christians would say that our chief end, our chief aim in life, our chief purpose is to glorify God, to worship Him, and most importantly, to come to know Him. Because unlike Islam, Christianity says that a relationship between humankind and God is not just possible, it is our very purpose. It is indeed the meaning of life. What about our third worldview question, morality? Is there an objective right and wrong? Can we determine what the good life looks like, and if so, how? That is one of the perennial questions of human existence, and indeed, as our technology gets more powerful, so the questions get bigger still. So what do our worldviews have to say in answer to that question? Well, despite a few brave attempts, atheistic naturalism has largely struggled with the question of morality. Indeed, some atheists go so far as to simply deny outright that morality exists. There simply is no such thing. Listen to these words written by one of the most famous atheists writing right now, Richard Dawkins of Oxford University. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. If this is true, why then are we so concerned with ethical questions? Well, other atheists, gentlemen like Michael Ruse and Edward O. Wilson, they would say, well, ethics is actually an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes in order to make us cooperate. Some atheists have gone that route. Other atheists have turned to relativism, which basically says you can make up your own morality on the fly. There are a whole number of options for the atheist, but the one option that doesn't seem to exist is to claim that there is actually an objective morality. You see, the problem for atheism is the universe consists of atoms and particles cannot impose an ought on you. Canadian atheist Kai Nielsen wrote this. He said, "Pure, practical reason. Even with a good knowledge of the facts, that will not get you to morality." So what of our other competing worldview? What about Islam? Well, our Muslim friends would say that God has commanded right and wrong. That's what the Quran is all about, and thus ethics flows from His will. What the God of Islam commands, you must obey, and what He tells you not to do, you must not do, and as human beings, the one thing you can't do is ask why. Well, again, those are two very different answers there in atheism and Islam, and again, I think both of them fail to be satisfactory. You see, the problem for atheism is that we all seem to have a very real experience of morality. When you've seen human trafficking in Cambodia, when you've seen genocide in Sudan, when you've seen the abuse of the poor, the very worst that human beings can do to each other, there is something inside us that screams evil, that justice is required, that shouts out that there is an objective morality. Well, does Islam help us find that objective morality? Not really. The God of the Quran, yes, He commands. But in Islam, those commands flow from His will. There is no objective good necessarily behind them. Allah could have commanded things very differently, and it would have been our duty to obey. And obviously, too, in Islam, if we keep enough of His commands, the big idea in Islam is that Allah may reward you and may allow you into paradise. But even there, the decision is ultimately His, because Allah, the God of Islam, is arbitrary. Indeed, God in Islam, His commands are arbitrary. Why has He commanded a certain thing? We don't know, say Muslim scholars. He simply has, and again, you can't ask why. Christianity takes a very different view of this question. Why does the God of the Bible command a thing? Why does He give a particular command? Well, says the Bible, because He is goodness itself. And His commands, the commands of the God of the Bible, flow from His nature. He is good. And what does He expect of us? Yes, He expects us to obey Him, but He also expects us to respond to the loving invitation He has offered us in the cross in Jesus Christ, to transform us and to fix the twist in our moral sense caused by sin. Christianity is not a moral self-improvement plan. It is a heart transformation plan. We turn then to our final worldview question, that of destiny. We've looked at origin, we've looked at meaning, we've looked at morality. Fourthly, destiny. Where ultimately are we headed? We'll comment just briefly as our time is short. Atheism gives a very straightforward answer. Our final destiny for the atheist is death, and then non-existence. There is no afterlife. There is no survival beyond the grave. The ultimate end for all of us, saint or sinner, is oblivion. And the same holds true for the universe. In a few billion years' time, the universe will cool and die. There will be no survivors, nothing, the absolute full stop. So what about Islam? Does Islam offer any hope? Well, arguably not much. For starters, you can never be sure in Islam whether your destiny is heaven or hell, above or below. Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was once asked if he knew where he was going on the Day of Judgment, and he replied that he had no idea where he would ultimately end up, because Allah, the God of Islam, his final decision is unknowable and arbitrary. Interestingly, both Islam and Christianity teach the existence of heaven and hell, although the concepts are utterly different, especially where heaven is concerned. For Islam, heaven is really a place, as you read the Quran, of earthly pleasures forever after, beautiful virgins, rivers of wine, and fruit trees. For Christianity, on the other hand, heaven is about the whole of reality being transformed. The Bible speaks of new heavens and new earth, and that those who trusted Christ will be resurrected with new bodies. God and humankind will once again be in close relationship. We shall no longer see as in a glass darkly, as the Apostle Paul puts it, but we shall see face to face. Revelation 21, describing how we will walk and talk once again with God. Paradise in Christianity is all about being reconciled completely, reunited completely with the God who is a God who can be known, a God who is relational. So we've looked at two worldviews, atheism and Islam, four very different questions: origin, meaning, morality and destiny. And those are vital questions, vital questions. You see, the more I talk to seekers, inquirers and skeptics, the more I'm struck that when it comes to these questions, when it comes to questions of origin, meaning, purpose, morality, destiny, most people have some hunches, if they're honest. You see, most people sense there is something special about human life, something that is precious and unique. Most people instinctively know that if your next door neighbour's house catches fire, you should rescue him, not his pet goldfish. Most people instinctively sense there is a purpose to life, even if at times it seems a little bit hard to get a hold of. Most people sense that issues of right and wrong, of justice and injustice are real and meaningful. And I think most human beings sense intuitively, deep down, that there is more to life than just the physical. There is a reason why religion and spirituality have always been part of the human experience. Yet here is the thing. Outside of the Christian worldview, and outside of the story of the ministry, death and resurrection of Jesus, outside of the gospel, there is no way to make sense of those hunches. No way to make sense of those fragments of truth, those broken pieces of answers. What each of us need, what our friends, our neighbours, our culture, what our world needs, is somebody to make sense of those hunches and those fragments. All of us need somebody to help us connect the dots, to put the fractured pieces, as it were, back together, to tell us the big story, to answer those questions in a coherent way. And I think most of us don't need a philosophical answer. Most of us are not looking for a what in terms of an answer. I think most of us are actually looking for a who. You see, as we've looked at those four big questions, origin, meaning, morality and destiny, I've used atheism and I've used Islam as dialogue partners, and I've shown briefly how their answers don't really satisfy. But there is another worldview, vastly different from atheism and vastly different from Islam, and that's the Christian worldview. You see, the Christian looks at these questions and says that if you want to know the answer to some of the most profound questions about humankind, you need to start with the God who revealed himself fully in Jesus Christ. You see, if we start from ourselves and our own ideas, from our own doubts, ultimately we're going to walk not merely in the wrong direction, but we're actually going to walk in circles. If Jesus is who he claimed to be, that affects the origins question. Human beings, you and I, are of infinitely precious value, enough that God would consider sending his son to die for you. If Jesus is who he claimed to be, that affects the meaning question. There is a purpose to life, and that purpose can be found through encountering the risen Jesus. If Jesus is who he claimed to be, that affects the morality question, not least that the biggest problem when it comes to good and evil is not the evil out there, but the evil in here, the brokenness in the human heart. Jesus claimed to have done something quite dramatic about that. And then fourthly, if Jesus is who he claimed to be, that affects the destiny question. Not because, as the church sometimes unhelpfully gives the impression, that if you give your life to Jesus, you'll get a ticket to heaven when you die. Jesus was about so much more than that. You see, the New Testament claims that the central event of Jesus' life and teaching, his death and resurrection, is the way that God is beginning to remake the world. and that God's glorious future offers those who trust in Jesus not merely a way to deal with our brokenness, but the promise of a resurrection of our own, lived out in a world that God has entirely remade and restored, creation as it should be. You see, when we really know whom we have believed, as 2 Timothy 1 verse 12 puts it, then we know who Christ is. And when we know who Christ is, we know what the gospel is, and we know who we are. And then our task, and the task of the church, is to take that truth out into the world and to share it humbly but confidently with those we meet. We don't need to be afraid of atheism. We don't need to be afraid of Islam. We do not need to be afraid of any competing worldview. We need fear none of those things, because we serve a risen Lord whose life and teaching and death and resurrection sheds light on all of the questions, all of the hurts, all of the brokenness here in this world. Jesus changes everything. If the gospel is true, it affects everything, and if it is false, everything crumbles. As C.S. Lewis wrote, he said this: Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. Grasping that truth is the key to know how the gospel is good news for our broken world, and how the Christian worldview makes sense in a way that none of the competing worldviews do. I'd like to bring this lecture to a close with this quotation from New Testament scholar N.T. Wright that I think sums up what I'm trying to say far better than I ever can. He wrote these words a few years ago. He says, "It isn't simply that the gospel of Jesus offers us a religious option which can outdo other religious options that can fill more effectively the slot labelled religion on the cultural and social smorgasbord. The gospel of Jesus points us, and indeed it urges us, to be at the leading edge of the whole culture, articulating in story and music and art and philosophy and education and poetry and politics and theology a worldview which will mount the historically rooted Christian challenge to both modernity and postmodernity, leading the way into the postmodern world with joy and humour and gentleness and good judgment and true wisdom." And if the gospel of Jesus is not the key to this task, then what is?